Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Anthropology 492 Anthropological Theory. We are down here in week 5. We are talking about materialism. We're talking about Roy Rappaport today. Talk about Marvin Harris on Friday. Next week, there's no class on President's Day, and you have test number 1 coming up. And I'll have. Do you all want an in-person review or a video review for Wednesday? What do you think? I'll be gone. Jose will be running. Do you want Jose to run a class where he goes over the test with you and talks about it and you can ask questions, or do you want him to just make a video? It's up to you. I'll tell him to do whatever you want. Hearing this, Jose? In person? That's good. We'll make him earn his hours. He can come here and talk to you about the test. But I'll have him record it too, I think, and then he can just upload it, or he'll send it to me and I'll upload if you can't figure it out. But yeah, we'll do some kind of review on Wednesday, and then on Friday we won't have in-person class. You'll have your test number 1. I just looked at it with him. I think it's 8 essay questions, no multiple choice or true false or anything like that. And just covering basically the big topics that we've talked about so far. Often the questions are just kind of expansions of quiz questions. I'll take 2 quiz questions and mesh them together, or I'll take a quiz question and kind of write a little bit more parts to it, right? They're going to be longer answers than just your quizzes, but oftentimes they'll have a lot of the same kind of bases. Okay. Yeah. Any questions about the schedule? We are all caught up, which is kind of fun. So you don't have to like have that day behind thing anymore. You got summary number 4, discussion board number 5, and quiz number 4 coming up this week, which I think is kind of cool because remember, there's only 10 quizzes, 10 discussion boards, and 10 homeworks in the class, and 2 tests. So we are 3 tests. So we will be a third of the way through the test and about halfway through, or 40% of the way through, quizzes and homeworks, which is kind of nice, right? If you're on top of things, that's kind of nice. You've already got 30 to 40% of your points for the class after next week. But if you're the kind of person who's behind, that's not as good. I'm going to have Jose send out emails, I think, this weekend. So if you're missing anything, he'll say, please turn it in, and we will add it to your gradebook. Okay. So last time we talked about for those 2 people who were here on Monday, the rest of you will say that it was very snowy and couldn't make it. What did we talk about? Who did we talk about? Hi. Was that Leslie White? Yeah, we talked about Leslie White, right? Probably the godfather of what we call materialism. And that's what we're doing this week, right? And how was Leslie White and his materialism pretty different than Boaz, right? We've established that he's basically Boaz's intellectual grandson, right? Boaz had Sapir, and Sapir had Leslie White, like physical sense, but in a like I had you in my class and you're my mentor sense, right? But Leslie White is not doing a very Boazian thing. What is he doing? The formula. What is the formula? What is that all about? What's his big, how might we classify Leslie White? And if he's not looking to Boaz, who maybe is he looking to for inspiration?
He's big to the idea that the level of cultural development is like technology.
Yeah. Technology and energy consumption in a society, right? And he does what's called unilineal evolution, right? All society, we're not talking about different cultures, we're talking about different societies on planet Earth, but culture is big C culture. There's only one human culture. We're all humans, and we can place every society on some kind of line from least energy use, least getting stuff out of the environment, to most. And of course, who's on top? We are America, 1950s America, right? This is like the birth of the atomic age, and we have reached finally we reached that 5th level of advancement, right? This is only like 10 or 15 years after the invention of the atomic bomb. So this is like really, world shattering at this time, right? We've accessed this unlimited source of power. Now we'll ascend to the next level, right? We also talked about maybe what are some problems with Leslie White and his ideas. What were some of them? What's the main ones? He's ethnocentric because he's on top, right? 50s America. And he has an equation, right? Isn't that science? It's an equation, it's got a math. Yeah, environmental degradation is very much a product of the 1950s, right? Like, if you've ever watched Mad Men or anything like that, environmentalism wasn't on the radar at this time. And you could create another kind of equation where people are living in harmony with their environment, right? Or equations for culture is equal to, maximum social harmony, or living in harmony with nature in the spirit realm, or something else. Different cultures may create a different equation for, who's most advanced. We're going to look at a couple examples. Roy Rappaport, I think, is probably my favorite of these mid-century kind of environmental. He's a little bit later, is probably why he can have absorbed some of these criticisms and moved on past them. But I think I super love Roy Rappaport's stuff, and it's very influential in my work. And I think it's a good way, right? Leslie White, I start with because he's an easy straw man, right? You can like beat up Leslie White pretty easily, even at the undergrad level. You can be like, yeah, this is kind of, like it seems nice and sciencey, but it's pretty suspect, right? But I think Roy Rappaport's stuff's really good and probably a little more hard to pick apart, or we'll talk about how, but a little more, grounded, we'll say. Okay, let's put a picture up. I think this one's funny, the short shorts. If as you become famous anthropologists, it's important to have a good fieldwork picture. It's probably the most important thing you'll learn all semester, because it will show up on your profile, and when you're long gone, that's the picture people will put up on, right? That's a pretty good picture, right? You can never tell it's me because my hair is blonde, but it's good to have an important picture. And I think Roy Rappaport has one. That's up to you. Okay. Let's see. I need a blank piece of paper. Bring one. We'll use this. Actually, let me just go grab a blank. Okay, so we're talking about Roy Rappaport today, and we read an excerpt from his book, Things for the Ancestors, and it's one of the classics of ecological or environmental anthropology. There it is, Things for the Ancestors. How much time do we have? Yeah, let's watch this video. We have time for it. We'll watch like 5 minutes of this quick video about what is ecological anthropology, right? This is kind of not an offshoot, but maybe a next step past just kind of materialism in general. And Roy Rappaport is probably most known for, if not starting this, at least being one of the founders of ecological anthropology. So let's take a look.
Now, if you look up ecological anthropology online.
Yeah, we'll talk about Roy Rappaport as one of the founders of ecological anthropology. But before we do, what is it? What you hear from the video? And how is this maybe a little different from what Leslie White was studying? Cultural ecology or ecological anthropology, kind of two words for the same thing. What is it all about?
How humans impact the environment.
Yeah, how humans impact the environment, right? And this is, again, if you think back to, I think it was Emily said about one of the criticisms of Leslie White, right? It didn't talk about environmental impacts, right? This is a little bit later. This is in the 60s and especially in the 70s. And again, it ties into the, anthropological theories are often the zeitgeist of the times, right? They connect to these like as environmental degradation, and the way that people impact their environment, not just getting resources, but impacting it negatively, that this is going to be reflected theoretically. So how people interact with their environment, how the environment interacts with people, and then how it changes over time. Yeah, And we'll look at a couple different things about this through the lens of Roy Rappaport's Pigs for the Ancestors. But before we do, let's talk about the man. Switch over to the dot cam. Roy Rappaport, born 1926. So significantly later than, Franz Boas or Durkheim or any of those guys. Died in 1997. Not that long ago. I mean, maybe for some of the, what year were you born? I was in high school when he died. You probably were just born, not born. It's getting close to 21st century at least, right? We're getting close. But yeah, primarily kind of a mid-century to late 20th century anthropologist. He is primarily associated with, ecological anthropology, also kind of cybernetic, which is not what you think. It's not robots, but it's about systems and how environments and humans act together in systems. And kind of taking, in many ways, right? We'll look at Marvin Harris next time. In many ways, Marvin Harris takes Leslie White's kind of stuff to comical experience or materialism. But I think Roy Rappaport stuff takes it to like, I mean, it's good science in a lot of ways. Some of the conclusions maybe, or how it's set up maybe is question, you could, but he just like does the work. Like he measures things and counts things in a way that maybe we don't see before, right? He does start off as as an archaeologist, like so many of us. Did field school in Polynesia in 1960, but like myself, loved the thrill of excavating, but just hated the lab work, right? If you've ever been faced with a long evening of washing potsherds after digging all day, I think you would know what I'm talking about. So very quickly switched over 1963, starts to do work in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. We've talked about Papua New Guinea before. We talked about Papua New Guinea, but a couple of people. We did work. Yeah, Margaret Mead did work in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Malinowski did work in the Trowbridge, just off the end of Papua New Guinea, right? This is kind of the classic. Papua New Guinea has often been called the ethnographic laboratory, right? Because there are hundreds of different languages in the highlands, often of groups of just a couple hundred people, in which you'll have very different ways of life in a very small area. So you can kind of keep the environmental constraints the same, right? We're not talking about people who live in Alaska versus in the Sudan. These are people who live on the same island, pretty close to each other, but doing very different things. And so generations and generations of ethnographers still go there. One of my classmates did her dissertation on that. She studied, political campaigns and new media, especially like cell phones and texting people. And language, especially in Papua New Guinea today. So if you're interested, there's still lots of work to do in PNG. He did work among a group called the Simbaga, live up in the highlands, very small group, Simbaga of PNG. And basically this is during 1963, doing his field work, and his book in 1968, Pigs for the Ancestors, comes out about that experience, and it was revised again in the 80s, I think. It was a pretty significant revision, which doubled the length of the book, and basically tried to address all the criticisms he had received, 20 years or so. And the main focus of his research is the ritual regulation of the environment, right? The connection between people and their environment. I have a graph or a picture. Let's see. Not that one. Not that one. There it is. All right, this really became the basis of his life work. We'll talk about this in a second, but he became very famous and especially kind of at the forefront of ecological anthropology, talked about. Often also called cultural ecology. Right, kind of very similar things, but kind of putting the emphasis one on the environment, one on culture, right? It's an ecological version of anthropology, or is it a cultural version of ecology, right? It's kind of depending on your focus. And he actually, this kind of ties to White. He ends up becoming chair at Michigan after White dies. and basically kind of continues this kind of materialist focus at Michigan. I think he stayed there till he died, or at least until he was fairly old. Okay, so you read an excerpt from Pigs today, ritual regulation of environmental relations among New Guinea people. This is from ethnology, actually, but it's a a shortened version of his larger work, and most of his stuff is kind of on the same topic, right? And he is interested primarily in the relationship that people have on their environment and how people's environments affect different societies. And again, he is kind of like Leslie White, in that he's not super big on the idea of cultures, right? He says that, like Leslie White, he's trying to make a science, right? All these materialists are trying to be science. Science has its own value in our culture. I'm always a little miffed that the Congress never includes cultural anthropology with the STEM programs. We're not sciencey enough. I ask how many congressmen have taken a cultural anthropology class. This is a thing with cultural anthropologists, right? Like, we've always had this kind of chip on our shoulder for the last 100 years. And there's always these kind of moves to make it, is anthropology, especially cultural, a science, or is it, humanities or something else, right? And people like White and Rappaport are like, yes, it is a science. We are, doing the same thing that, in many ways, Rappaport's work is like, yeah, we're doing a very similar thing to like what people are doing in like fish and wildlife ecology, population-y type programs, right? Looking at kind of big groups of people, and he's more interested not in cultures, He does believe in culture, but we're not studying cultures, he said, but we are studying populations. Why might the study of populations instead of cultures be interesting to someone who is working with an ecological paradigm? Yeah, right. You can study populations of any animal, right? You can study populations of beavers or birds or fish or whatever, right? So he's saying that, like, yeah, we're doing the same thing. There's just this added layer, right? And just like White, he has this kind of generative view of culture that, biology is super important and culture kind of emerges out of it, right? We evolve as humans, we, become smarter, and we start to create cultures or culture, right? But he says cultures, like cultures are totally cool. He's not like, not necessarily that's just White, maybe where cultures aren't, he doesn't talk about them very much. But cultures, Rappaport says, is really cool, but not really useful for our study because it's hard to define them empirically, right? Where are the boundaries of a culture, right? Because he says, in many ways, like for being a real strict materialist and ecological person, he recognizes what we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks, that cultures are inherently symbolic, right? Symbol and meaning, this goes back to Buzz, this is Saussure, this is all those people, right? That this symbol right here is a what? A cross, religious meaning. What else is it? A T, linguistic meaning. What else is it? A addition sign, mathematical meanings. How do we know what it means in this context? This has no context. So it doesn't have any meaning, right? You need to be like in the mind frame of I'm doing math, or I'm looking at a bunch of words, or I'm in a church, right? And then it tells you what it means. It's hard, super hard, and it doesn't actually, it's hard to have boundaries, right? Like, when's the boundary of American culture, right? And how do we determine, well, is like subcultures part of this, or are people in California really the same culture as people in New York? Is people, do people who live across the border in Tijuana, are they really the same culture as, are they closer in culture to the people in San Diego, or is San Diego closer to New York, right? Because they're Americans. This is a debatable thing. This is populations are better to study at this level because we can like delineate something, a physical population, right? Again, whether we agree with that or not, I do think it is that like he is staking his claim as a science here, and he's saying, well, like colleges study population, so that's what we as anthropologists need to study because it's commiserate, right? And his understanding of these populations is that populations live in an environment, right? Populations in an environment. And we talked about this with the video. How do populations impact their environment? What are some of the ways that human populations, like a group of people, say living in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, might impact their environment? All right, I'm gonna make a canoe. I need to cut down this tree. I'm gonna make a farm. I'm gonna cut down these trees. I'm gonna farm, this happens in my communities. We do slash and burn agriculture. If I use the same piece of land for too long, it's gonna degrade the soil fertility, right? If I fish too much out of one river and I don't have any kind of way to stop my society, if my society grows exponentially, pretty soon they're gonna eat up all those fish, right? There's tons of these things, right? And archaeologically, I think this is more pertinent, or at least the idea has taken hold a little bit more, right? Archaeologists still do this kind of thing, right? Thinking about, well, if people are like living in the desert, what's their society going to be like versus, those of you who are in our last coast, right? If you live in the Pacific Northwest coast and you're doing salmon farming or salmon harvesting, what's your society going to look like? The camera's not even on me. Shooting in the sky. Okay. So people impact their environment, but environments also, circumscribe the amount of people who live there, the types of civilizations or societies you might have there, right? You're going to have a very different society if you live in the desert versus if you live in, a sweet spot between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, 10,000 or 6,000 years ago, right? And he says that in most societies, or all societies is probably what he would say, there is a problem with unchecked resource use, right? If populations grow exponentially and people have unlimited wants, then environments are going to degrade. And he says that all societies around the world, or at least this is his thesis, right, create cultural ways of maintaining environmental sustainability, or at least, that's a good idea. He says they also can lead to environmental destruction at the same time, right? The culture impacts environment, but in particular in the article, he's looking at the ways that it's adaptive, often framed as adaptations. But he does recognize, again, this is like the 60s and 70s, that even if cultures are trying to live in an environment, like economic systems or political decisions can really impact it, right? And anthropologists around the world have been interested in who are, especially these cultural ecologists or ecological anthropologists and adaptations to environment, or not. So for instance, in my communities where I do my field work and Jose does his field work, people primarily still do slash and burn or milpa agriculture, right? Where you cut down a piece of forest, you burn it, or you mulch it, depending on if it's rainy or dry season. That stuff goes into the soil. You plant your corn, you harvest your corn, you eat your corn. You probably plant there a couple times, 2 or 3 times maybe, and then you let it go back to fallow. And traditionally in my communities, it's like a 50-year cycle before you come back to that acreage of land. Right now, it's because of population pressures and other political factors, people would say, it's down to 7 years. So what do you think the ecological impact of going from 50 years before you can use the same farm again to 7 years is? Do you think it has an impact? What are the impacts? Both positively and negatively. Okay, if you plant the land more often, you could have more people living there, right? Because you're using that land more efficiently in like a Leslie White sense, but you're also degrading the environment, right? Because there are these cultural systems in place, which, in the Maya case is the Alcade system, or in the Simbaga cases, the pig ritual. But there are also, political and economic considerations, which often can upset the balance here, right? Yeah. Okay. And in the article, he talks about, and he goes through this ritual, and this is kind of a graph. Rappaport is also known as, this is a big, 1960s especially, this was kind of a buzzword, the cybernetic stuff, right? Systems, right? Systems with feedback loops. And this comes out of like mechanical engineering, maybe, or electrical engineering, right? This idea that if you have a system, you can create like a logical system, a map of a system, whether it's a circuit or a machine or something like that. And one part of machine is going to impact another, right? If you have a steam locomotive, you have a system, right? You put coal in there, you add fire, it creates, you create steam through this, it builds up pressure within the engine, it makes the engine go. You stop putting coal in there, right? It decreases the pressure and the speed stops, right? You can kind of map out how all that would work. And that's what Rappaport says we can actually do with environments. We can map these things out and we can figure out how changes to one part, right? If you turn valve A, how that's going to affect the entire system versus if you turn valve B or something, right? And he goes through, the article is really a good example of like what he actually does in his work, right? It's very ethnographic, right? He did his field work, he lived there. It's a pretty small community, about 200 people. It gives you kind of a little bit of ethnographic background, but really quickly jumps into, by like the third page, right? Kind of the ecological framework of these people, right? And this is classic ethnography going way back, way before Rappaport, like going back to like, Evans Pritchard or, some of the early Boasians. Oftentimes, anthropologists have recognized that environment's super important to a people, right? And so oftentimes your first chapter, second chapter in your book is like describing the environment, or at least has a piece in there describing the environment in which the people live, right? So if you're working in Belize, you talk about, well, they live in the Maya Mountains. It's between this many meters and this many meters. They get this much rainfall a year, primarily. People are farming this, and this, and there's these kind of animals here, right? Because it kind of sets the stage for what you want to talk about. And if you don't do it in the right order, right, people are going to be like, it doesn't make any sense, right? So oftentimes the ecology is still, in many anthropological works, very early on. He talks about what kind of environment they live in, but really focuses on their ecosystem, right? What kind of plants and animals they depend on for reproducing society, right? They're bush fallow horticulturalists. They primarily do root crops, sweet potatoes, taro, and yam, and really enjoy pigs, right? And kind of the relationship between sweet potatoes and these other root crops and pigs and the human population all kind of form this system, which I show you on this graphic, right? Which he maps out kind of throughout his article. And he has this really funny quote, like he just was measuring everything, right? So, unlike some of the other work where they're like, yeah, these people do a lot of, they have lots of cows, right? Tons of cows. They love cows, right? He's really into like positivist data. Again, he's trying to make this a science, right? So sugar sweet potatoes produce on average 4.6 million calories per acre, right? So it's very, they take between 24 and 76 weeks to plant. I estimate that approximately 310,000 calories per acre is expended on cutting, fencing, planting, maintaining these farms, right? Energy expenditure ratios of 17:1. That sounds very scientific in a way that's like, I don't know, maybe I'm susceptible, but it seems way more scientific than someone like Leslie White, right? Creating these kind of, Leslie White tries to be scientific and creates these equations, but I think like, I did this kind of stuff too. Like, how many pounds of chocolate are you actually producing? Well, last year I produced 548 pounds, right, on 16 acres, and I went to the farm 17 times in the last month or something, right? So trying to like quantify these things. Why do you think this is important? Why do you think he's doing this? Why is he so interested? Not only there, but he keeps doing it throughout, right? Like there's this many people and there's this many pigs, and you know, people eat between 43 and 55 grams of protein a day or something like that, or a month. Daily, yeah. Why is he so interested in numbers? Science, right? And it gives you a little shield when someone's like, well, how do you know that? You're like, well, I measured it, right? I counted it. I know how I'm the expert. I know how many calories per acre of sweet potatoes produce. And it helps you create these kind of models, right? Because you're actually putting data in instead of just like, some of these other, in some ways it's very similar to a structural functionalist understanding, but it has a lot of data to kind of back it up, unlike some of these other ones we've looked at. So he talks about the garden cycle. He also talks about the pigs. And why are pigs important in this society? What's about pigs? He named a book after pigs. So it's important title. It's social fact, yeah. But like, why else are they important? Ecologically, why are they important? I guess. Not just as a social fact. Yeah, the natural resource in their primary protein source for these people, right? Rappaport and Chagnon, another guy we're not going to read, but another one of students of white, we're super obsessed with protein, right? Like, and this was kind of the focus of resources, like resource extraction in these societies and warfare and all this stuff depended on protein, right? We had to have so much protein, and this is especially coming out of the kind of man the hunter kind of era, right? That protein is super important, right? Vegetables are whatever, and they're important too, but these pigs are really important, so these cultures keep. But pigs have problems. What are the problems with keeping pigs? Why don't I, as a Simbaga person, want to have 1 million pigs, or even 100 pigs? Why don't I want 100 pigs? He says, what does he say about pigs? This is like the crux of his argument. He says that what? Too many pigs is a problem. If you have a little bit of pigs, it's okay, it's great. And they actually are useful, right? They can give you, they're around. They especially help kind of turn the ground over as they root for things, right? They do a little bit of weeding, they eat little stuff in there. But what's the problem with too many pigs? They eat a lot of food and they tear up the gardens. We have the same beliefs. Actually, unfenced pigs are now illegal in the village that I did my field work in because there's such a problem. They'll go and they'll tear up people's gardens. They'll strip the bark off your cacao trees, which is where the fruit or the flowers come out of and make the fruit. It basically leads to people fighting each other and killing each other over drama, pig drama. And he said this is a problem in this society as well, right? This is on 21. Small numbers of pigs are easy to keep. They run free. You don't have to feed them. They just eat garbage. They're awesome, right? But if a pig grows too large, right, you end up, instead of the pigs working for you, you work for your pigs, right? You have to maintain these pigs. And if you get too many, things start to go bad, right? And pigs are nasty and smelly and they just poop everywhere and people get sick and stuff like that. So he said that there is a system which people have created through ritual, right, to regulate this environment. And this is a kind of a map of it, right? Let's see, where do we start? So people start to raise pigs down here, on the bottom. We'll use this there starting. Number of pigs increases after a number of years. And as you get more and more pigs, it puts pressure, right? This is, remember our valves. Turn valve A, increase pigs from 1 to 10, right? Puts pressure on another piece of the system. Again, this is very structural functionalist in some ways, right? It affects the gardens. As I increase pig dial, garden productivity goes down because the pigs are rampaging, right? Social conflict goes up because pigs are rampaging, right? And he says that there is a ritual cycle. that maintains kind of order in this system, right? There's this ritual, almost like a relief valve, if you think of it like in a mechanical system, right? If pressure builds up too much in your steam locomotive, it's going to blow. There's a relief valve, right? The steam shoots off, lowers the pressure. The steam locomotive does not explode, right? And he says ritual acts as that. He says there's this Roombin plant, and they pull it up when there's too many pigs, and it starts this cycle of warfare, right? And again, he says that he makes this kind of argument about protein that, like, as pigs are not generally eaten in this society during normal times, right? You're not going to have like, oh, come over on Saturday for a barbecue of pigs, but it's used in times of stress, right? And he has this. This is probably, I think, the weakest part of his argument, that people in times of stress need more protein, right? And so he sees examples that, in warfare, there's these taboos against eating pig are lifted. When there is sickness in the community and someone's weak, the taboo against eating pigs is lifted, right? Because it allows people to get this protein. And I kind of think it's also salt probably too, is probably part of the other thing as well. But during this time period, right, there are warfare, and following warfare, right, there is a truce or a rout of the people. And during this time, pigs are ritually slaughtered, and it brings back the population back in check. Once this has happened, they replant this plant, and until the plant is big enough to be uprooted, there is no more warfare in those societies, right? So you have to kind of take a time out for a little bit. This allows the pig population to come back because you've just eaten all of them. And you can't have another war if you're not going to have big pig fest to eat. But it also lets the human population come back, right? You're not just having constant warfare. It's creating truces between these different societies and allowing things to kind of regenerate themselves. The actual steps, you can read about them in the article, but I think what's important is the creation of a system, right? The mechanical, electrical feedback system, and the kind of the release valve, and ritual as a release valve. And he's, for being kind of a ecological scientist person, he really emphasizes ritual and why ritual is important. And he has a later book, Culture and Ritual as Adaptation, or Ritual and Religion in the Making of Humanity, which basically says that it's ritual and that leads to kind of the creation of society, right? Creates understandings of the natural world. It creates relationships between people. And I think unlike our common sense notion is that religion breeds rituals, right? We have religion, we're Christian or Buddhist or Muslim, and then there's all these rituals that go along with it, right? Christmas and Easter, and all this is derived from the religion. But for Rappaport, he says the opposite. The ritual happens first, and that religion kind of is built on top of these things over time, right? So ritual is kind of the base layer and creates these social components. We're almost out of time, but I did want to talk, kind of end on this last concept of his, and we're going to kind of come back to this with Marvin Harris. We could talk a lot about ritual, and I definitely think you should check out this article and try to figure out how it all fits together. Operational environment. He says when studying the environment, as anthropologists, right, and this is like a methodological thing, oftentimes the way that we as outsiders understand an environment or an ecological system is often very different from an insider's perspective, right? Rappaport created this diagram of how pigs and gardens and warfare and ritual all fit together. But it wouldn't necessarily, a local person may not make that same diagram, right? He says that for local people, that this is really about, maintaining relationships with the spirit world, creating relationships of, spirituality and stuff. And for him, it's about ecology. So which is right? Is it the local's perspective, or is it the outsider's perspective? Was that? Probably. Or here's a trick question. Not anytime, usually when I give you an either or question in anthropology, it is, yes, it's both, right? He makes a distinction between the cognized environment, what local people think of that environment. So for instance, in my work in Belize, people's environment with cacao farming isn't just people and trees and pigs and all that other stuff. There's a spiritual component. They believe there are spirits that live in the groves of wild cacao who are the owners of those cacao. And that if you want to harvest that cacao without having those ghost spirit monstery things attack you and suck the salt out of your body, you need to leave them rum and cigarettes and other kinds of nice prizes. And then you have this exchange with them, and then you can harvest the cacao, right? This is their cognized environment versus their operational environment. This is what Rappaport is doing when he's counting calories, right? For a local Sembaga person, the amount of calories per acre is just like completely nonsense, right? The idea of calories doesn't make sense. The idea of acres, right? It's not how they conceptualize their environment. And this is going to be very similar to what we'll talk about with Marvin Harris next time, emic versus edic. Edic. Insider versus outsider views of the environment. And it's a big question that we wrestle with in anthropology all the time. How do we reconcile the fact that maybe people are telling us one thing, but we as researchers are seeing something else, or have these different ideas of how to kind of operationalize the world. So we are out of time. Again, we could talk just forever about Roy Rappaport. I love his stuff, and I think it's directly applicable. And I think one of the reasons it has staying power and why it is a straw man for most of us is that he actually counts them, right? Like, it's much harder to argue with these things when you're actually showing data that says, well, like this happens over time and this many calories. One of the things that he does say, though, is that this is, unlike structural functionals, who doesn't really account for historical change, he does, right? And he says that one of the things that's really upset this is colonial interference. They just showed up, like, white people didn't show up to the highlands of New Guinea until like World War II, like it was fairly late. But they stopped the cycle of ritual warfare, right? Because they said no more warfare within, this is Australia at the time, within the Australian colonial territories. So how these colonial changes can actually impact these systems, right? If you take a piece or a chunk out of the system, how does the system either reconfigure itself in times of crisis or fall apart? Okay, that's it for Roy Rappaport. Love him. I think he's great.